I do think we need to talk a little bit more about Trey Lance. Like, this is a big, big, big deal.
Yeah. I mean,
And
it's the equivalent of you. I mean, it's the equivalent of you having to trade Julio after 2 years because he's not good enough, right? I mean,
sure it is.
and like, let's back the truck up and say, what if that were to, like, you obviously don't have the counterfactual because he played and he was pretty good as a rookie, and then by year 2 he's one of the top receivers in the league. So you really didn't have to like really ponder anything. But what if you would have came out and been, because it's not like Trey Lance was bad as much as what the plan was to sit him in year 1, get him some NFL kind of look-sees, and then play him in year 2, and he gets injured in year 2, and other guys stepped up in his stead, and then he comes back, and yes, he wasn't great this preseason, but we're not talking about Zach Wilson here. We're not talking about a guy who's played a lot and struggled. We're talking about a guy who's rarely played and struggled, and then behind the scenes, the information must have been much worse than what we were seeing publicly.
Okay, let's start with context here for everyone. This is, when I say it's a big, big, big deal, 3 bigs, it's a big, big, big deal because you're not talking about a bunch of lame-o people running the organization kind of on their way out. You're talking about one of the better head coaches, top-tier head coaches, pure head coach, and you're talking about a very, very good football man in John Lynch, right? So you're talking about a team and ownership who puts it out there. This is a really good organization. For context, I'm just saying you can sit there and say, well, if it were just to be some other people who are randoms that they made a move like this, but this happened with a group that is really good and knows what they're doing. So I think for everyone, when you get fan bases out there throwing darts at their general managers and their head coaches because they're not thinking straight, this can even happen with an organization that is on top of it. So let's talk about that a little bit because that's an important concept.
Well, I don't even think that. I think you're right, and I think that it draws you to the reason why it was able to actually happen, because they have the cachet. I mean, this is like, and again, I'm gonna couch everything I say with John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have done a phenomenal job. They've taken this team to a Super Bowl and 2 other NFC title games. They failed on this pick, and in Trey Lance's 2 years in San Francisco, they've made 2 conference title games. Isn't that crazy? Like, they're moving off of a mistake despite team success.
Did you see Peter King's comments, your buddy? I love Peter too. I mean, he ripped Kyle. Interesting, he didn't rip John at all. I'm just surprised that it all went to Kyle, probably because Kyle is the quarterback guru. But what I think is important here is, so let's start going backward, right? 10 or 15 years ago, if you were making a move on your first round top 5 quarterback, how many have over the last 5 or 8 years? We've seen some of the best GMs in this league, and some not as well regarded, but are really good personnel people, move on from their first round quarterback. By the way, I look back sometimes and I only laugh. If I would have missed on Matt Ryan in 2 years, I probably would have been gone. But that's
I think Thomas, you bring up the point, right? Which is, in some ways, so I think this is provided that the manger for these 2 men, though, because in their first year they passed on Patrick Mahomes for Solomon Thomas. Yeah. Like, this is not the first time. Like, and that was that Brian Hoyer was on the roster. It wasn't some imaginary like, oh, they had a guy there. And by 19, they're in the Super Bowl, and they traded DeForest Buckner and got the pick for Javon Kinlaw. That didn't work either. And you think about how many mistakes that they've made. I don't think it's more mistakes than the average team. It's just that what they've hit on when they've done good things has been enormous. And they've gotten the runway to have, when they both signed their deals, everybody talked about how they had 6-year deals together, because that Niners team, if people forget this, when they moved on from Jim Harbaugh, it went Jim Tom Sula 1 year, Chip Kelly 1 year. And so they wanted to make sure they gave the people the runway for being able to do it. And to your point, like, Thomas, if Matt Ryan would have flopped, I'm guessing the Falcons would have moved. Who knows, right? I mean, your other picks did great too, but who knows if they would have stayed. But this team, in some ways, the Niners built up a team so good that they felt the quarterback was the next piece, and they were wrong. And their team was still so good that they could still win with that mistake. And they've been able to do that despite a lot of mistakes, which has been kind of funny. And I think that's the same thing about a lot of, like, I mean, Bill Belichick for 10 years really has not had as much luck on the draft as his first. And maybe some of that might have been, his director of college scouting was a different guy, but it might have, I'm looking for a smirk there, Thomas.
That's a good one. I got it.
But I think that the longer that a guy is in charge, the more mistakes or more things that don't work out for him come up, and it makes you go back and appreciate the other team building aspects that they had. So it's a big issue for the Niners, but they've done enough to build themselves the opportunity to get off this, much like Howie was able to get off of Carson Wentz. Similar ideas where you're able to cut bait on these things when you have success. It's almost this like double whammy of privilege there.
Well, I mean, who was it? Let's talk about. So Howie, you mentioned there. You talk about Les Snead, right? Les and what they did. You talk about Joe Douglas is in a spot right now. It's going to be, it's who knows how it plays out. All of those guys are really good at what they do, however people judge them, right? I just want to come back to the fact that it's not an exact science. And by the way, do I want to fold back into SumerSports and how it's not an exact science? Ergo, why not utilize an augmentation tool that's going to help the percentages? It's not going to be perfect. We know that. But that is something that we all understand. There's so much data out there. We need to start tapping into it now. And interestingly enough, I feel that owners are a lot more understanding of this right now than they used to be. And although I still do believe that you are gauged off your ability to pick quarterbacks adeptly and not only pick them, but find replacements and move on when the time is to move on. Howie moved on when the time was moved on. He is still considered one of the top 2, 3, or 4 GMs in the league.
You saw that when they were in Houston last year for Thursday Night Football, one of the fans was like, Howie, are you going to apologize for the Jalen Reagor pick? Because they took Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson. And he turns around, he's like, I brought you to the Super Bowl. Like, and again, and this is me, like, the Eagles, even though they made the blunder and the Vikings got Jefferson, who's the second best player in the league, in my opinion, it's about your other selections, right? Be such a well-rounded GM that any one pick doesn't kill you, right? And I think that that's what Howie has nailed and the Niners have nailed. Now, one question I have, because our friend Peter, in his Monday Morning Quarterback was not complimentary. I mean, he was very scathing. I know a lot of people, like, for example, your friend Lombardi, Michael Lombardi, was also giving out information that he thought that it was Mac Jones, and how much of this is the fact that the Niners either not lied to the media. I'm not saying that, but the Niners did not show their hand to any media that year. And as such, when this thing goes down, they don't have the one person coming out of the woodwork being like, oh, but because I look, and she's a friend of mine, so I'll say it, like Jordan Rodriguez writes for The Athletic, and she's given great access to the Rams. And I think when you read her articles, you're like, that's a person who's plugged in and oftentimes will get the reasoning for all these moves ahead of time so that they can sort of soften. And there's been times, Thomas, when somebody in the league has been like, look, we're doing this. I need you to explain this on Twitter, your podcast and stuff. Like, I've had that happen to me, and I'm just me. Like, and so I wonder if the 49ers, the reason they drafted Trey Lance is still basically opaque to the whole media. Is there a lack of, not empathy is the wrong word, but like there aren't any people coming in and defending them? And do you think that that's because they decided to be so secretive with what they're doing with the third pick?
It could be. I feel like there's a lot that, yes, to answer your question, I do believe that. I mean, Peter King, of course, is dialed in with everyone. He has really good relationships with most people. He's not a guy that's throwing stuff, but he is outspoken at times when it's time to be outspoken. And I respect the hell out of him for that. I started thinking a lot about this as well, though. Not only the privacy side of it and the secretive sort of, I don't even know if it's the clandestine is the right word. Make no mistake about it, brother, because I've been around this. When there's a mistake within an organization, there are people within that organization who truly went to the well for that person and they slam the table. They're not always necessarily the top guys. There are people in that organization right now that are praying that it doesn't get out who truly was the biggest supporter of Trey Lance. Because if it does get out that they can pin it to someone, then of course the media does their thing. Everyone rolls on it. And will that prevent that person from having an opportunity to be a general manager? Because it is such a big deal. They are claiming that this is this second or is this the worst quarterback deal? I think they were talking about the trade for Russell Wilson was the biggest blunder. This was someone that was talking about it recently. I won't even give the guy credit. Is this a bigger blunder than the Russell Wilson acquisition? I know it's college and pro. In your mind as an analyst, statistician, unbelievable mathematical genius that you are, what's more of a blunder?
It's the Wilson one, just because of the way, you tied so much money to it, and it sort of prevented you from doing a lot of things. I'm going to propose a third option though. The San Diego Chargers in 1998 moved up from pick 3 to pick 2, and they traded 2 1s, a 2, a 3, Eric Metcalf, who's a legend of the game, and got Ryan Leaf. And that's another one where you're like, that's tough. I know it's sort of a weird thing, but in 1990, the Colts moved up from, I think, the Colts traded Chris Hinton, Andre Rison, so 2 All-Pros, and a couple other things for Jeff George's pick. And that was a pretty rough one as well, because they won 30% of the games. This one's up there. I'm never going to fault a team for taking a shot on a young quarterback, though. I think the Lance one is interesting because he has almost no data. And so you can make an argument that you just have a weaker case to make for the player. But I would never when the Eagles went up and got Wentz, when the Rams went up and got Goff, when the Chiefs went up and got Mahomes, man, if you hit on that quarterback, it's just a different game. Imagine if Lance was a 7 out of 10. This team's a Super Bowl favorite every year.
So you say you'll never fault anyone. I won't fault anyone for having the nuts to do what they need to do. Believe me, I'm a be aggressive when it's time to be aggressive. The only thing that when I step back and I look at situations where you're talking about lower level competition and you're talking about not, how many reps that they had, whatever that plays out to, where you're like, I don't really care because I see this player being unbelievably athletic and et cetera, that's where, okay, you might hit, but I have always felt this way. Put this stuff aside. I used to argue with a lot of the scouts that we, over the years we were growing up, and I have some really good friends who would take shots and talk about people in our draft rooms about this guy's amazing. And they might miss on 9 out of 10 and hit on 1 out of 10. The 1 out of 10, they hung on for another 10 years because they hit on that guy. And I don't believe in that. I believe you need consistency in your approach, and you need to look at all things that you're looking at, not just the athleticism and the height, weight, speed, jump stuff, but truly the entire platform to make your decision. Let me come back for a second here. And I would say, back to what we're talking about with San Francisco, there are people within that building that are worried that it doesn't get out, that it's publicized who the massive supporter was. In the end, it doesn't matter for that group, and they know that. It's the organization pick. It was everyone involved, and that's the way that it should be, on the good ones and the bad ones. Unfortunately, believe me, there will be someone trying to dig that out, and it'll end up in Mike Florio's, his report in the near future, who was the big supporter. And it's unfortunate because it should go towards
and we know that that's true because people use it the other way, right? And I think Brett Veach is a fantastic general manager for the Chiefs. Don't get me wrong. But when the Chiefs were struggling to draft players for about 2-3 years, it always came up that Brett Veach was the guy that pounded the table for Mahomes because it was used as capital, right? To, because the Chiefs had some, not so productive drafts in 2018 and 2019. So the other side of the coin is the same thing, right? Somebody's going to use it against that person
Yes.
if and when they ever can, because we know that information exists within buildings because people will use it for somebody they're trying to protect when the time comes. It's very interesting. To your point about going 1 for 10, I think at quarterback, it's tough because when you're a normally constructed NFL team, you hit on a quarterback, then a lot of sins are forgiven. And yet I think with the 49ers, the way that they're constructed, the rest of their roster and their coach was always such that a quarterback was just a driver of the car and not the whole vehicle. And I feel like they deviated a little bit in going with Lance, who in the ceiling was that Mahomes, everything, everywhere, all at once quarterback. When in reality, I actually somewhat believe the reports that they like Lance too, or not Lance, Mac Jones too, because Mac is kind of the car driver, and the same way that Brock Purdy's the car driver. And I think the quarterback for the Niners is Kyle Shanahan. And I think that's, when your team is constructed differently than everybody else's, and I think that theirs is, you have to draft differently than everybody else too, because otherwise the mistakes are magnified like this. And again, we throw all this up. The Niners are the second favorite in the NFC to make the Super Bowl this year. They have a win total. They're favorites in their own division by quite a bit. They're a good franchise that whiffed on a quarterback. And frankly, I think they're getting too much flack for it because you got to go back and say all the stuff they hit on. At the same time, I do think that it's something to learn from. It's interesting. We have a Chiefs fan, Ryan, here, who says, who is behind the Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick? We don't talk about that draft pick anymore.